Okay, hi everyone. I hope you're well. Apologies again, I can't be with you in person today, but through the wonders of digital technology, we can still push on with this module. So today what we're going to be looking at is the business response to sustainability. So we've been looking at all those different driving factors over the last few weeks. We've looked at the uprising across lots of different stakeholders, whether it's the public at large, whether it's employees, investors. We've looked at the need to take the interconnectivity of lots of issues into consideration when we're approaching sustainability. So yes, the environmental side and the emission side, but also the biodiversity, the social side, the justice. We've looked at the emergence of that kind of push in terms of international agreements and regulation, the global goals, the sustainable development goals, the Paris Agreement. And with all of that happening, we've also looked at the trends, I suppose, in terms of, our emissions are still continuing to go in the wrong direction. And there's a huge urgency now on business in particular and industry to step up and to completely change their pace and their ambition around their sustainability response. So it can be really easy to ask, why should business care? They're in the business of being in business, they're in the business of making profit, of serving their shareholders. Why is it something that they need to look at in terms of sustainability and climate action? And what's really changing businesses' approach is, all of those factors that we've talked about in terms of stakeholder pressure, but also this risk piece now that we've touched on as well. So supply chains being impacted today by climate action, stranded assets being impacted today in terms of investment portfolios, all of these different things at a macro level really starting to impact on the day-to-day approach of business and really making them wake up to the fact that they need to change tact in terms of how they've been embedding sustainability in the past. So corporate sustainability has gone through a number of different iterations. Very much started around environmental responsibility and resource efficiency, and looking at those, low-hanging fruit essentially that were measures that, yes, increased environmental benefits, but also delivered cost savings to the company. So looking at your energy reduction, your waste reduction, your water reduction, all things that still need to be done, but nowhere near the level of thinking and response that we need from business in terms of real climate action. Then we saw this move into CSR, corporate social responsibility. So branching out sustainability to take into account those social issues. How are people being treated in your company, in your supply chains? Are you being a good neighbor in those locations where you've got, whether it's factories or companies set up? To now, this approach, which has been the most popular one over the last few years, the triple bottom line, and we touched on it a few weeks ago, this idea that we need to get to this sweet spot in the middle, right? So figure out how the company or the industry can continue the economics of it, but do so in a way that respects those environmental limits that we now understand and meets the needs of society. So the triple bottom line approach is still, it's a good theory. It's where somewhere we should be aiming to get to. But what's happened over the last few years is we've talked a lot about this. We've seen a lot of companies align their strategies with this approach. But all we've actually seen in terms of impact is business as usual with just a bit of tinkering around environment and around society issues. And so much so that the founder of this theory, John Elkington, actually revoked it a few years ago because he was not happy with how it was being used and really being used as a greenwashing tool, essentially to help companies talk about sustainability, but wasn't delivering on the type of action that he had expected to see off the back of it. And, we've seen example after example over the last few years of companies letting us down on their sustainability activities. We saw the high profile case of Volkswagen in 2015 in terms of their emissions doctoring. We saw last year in terms of Nestle and their cocoa supply chain, deforestation issues, slavery issues, child labor issues. We saw SeaWorld a few years ago, trying to defend their business model approach in terms of how good they care for their animals, how well they were looking after them. And then obviously all of us probably seeing the footage and the fallout from that in terms of what was really happening. So there is an understandable level of distrust with companies on their sustainability approach. And again, another driving factor for companies changing pace now is they're running out of room to hide on this. That it's much easier for people to find the gaps now in terms of where improvements need to be made and where maybe inaction is occurring. So with all that in mind, now we're seeing this complete shift in terms of business approach. So we're moving a world away from our shareholder value, just looking at the business model in terms of profit, in terms of meeting the needs of shareholders, to this kind of attempt at shared value where we were trying to get to that sweet spot, but it didn't quite work, to now understanding that we need to take the next step into system value. So business really starting to understand that it has to sit within these wider, more important limits of society and environment. And it needs to approach its future business model and its sustainability with that in mind. So this isn't around a few environmental initiatives anymore, trying to reduce energy and reduce emissions. This is around fundamentally looking at the business model and figuring out, can it exist as is, in a net zero world? Can it exist as is in a fairer world? And if not, having to go back and redesign why it is that business exists, what is its purpose beyond profit, and what does that look like in terms of when it's up and running. And because we've got this perfect storm now of, all that pressure from the different stakeholders, we've got regulation and litigation coming in, and we've got a limit now. We know what the science is telling us. We have only a few years left to make decisions, to put in the infrastructure that we need to kind of turn things around. So this perfect storm now has really helped push the pace at which business is responding. And we've never seen the level of ambition and the speed at which it's coming that we have over the last few months in particular. So business is really starting to grow up around sustainability and starting to completely change how they think about it. And one of the big shifts that we're seeing is around the target setting. So like I say, if you took a strategy from a few years ago, you'd find good targets in there around energy, water and waste, but they were still nowhere near that level of thinking that we needed, that level of ambition that we needed in terms of real climate action. But now what we're seeing is companies using the science to inform their targets. So looking at your business model, are you a high energy user? If we're talking about getting to a 1.5 degree world, you need to decarbonize ASAP. And that is a huge ask, throughout the company's operations, throughout their supply chains. But this is the level that we need to get to in terms of driving real action. So we have over 1,000 companies now setting science-based targets. This is having a huge ripple effect. So it's typically those bigger companies setting these targets, but all their suppliers now falling under those targets and now all being nudged to take action as well. So we're really starting to see the pace increase. And we're starting to see finally a whole inclusive look at a company's impact. So when we talk about emissions, we've got these 3 scopes of emissions: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And your scope 1 are your direct emissions. So if you're a retailer, let's say, your stores are your scope 1 emissions, your offices are your scope 1 emissions, your fleet is your scope 1 emissions. And that's traditionally where all the targets would have sat, which arguably is the easier place, things in your direct control. Your scope 2 is all around your energy sourcing. But then your scope 3 is everything else. So it's where you source all your raw materials from, any manufacturing that goes on before products get to you, different kind of logistics that happen between the supply chain, any waste that's created, business travel, if you're a big consultancy and there's a huge amount of business travel going on. And then the other end of the supply chain in terms of your customer, what happens to your product when it leaves your factory? How is it used? How is it disposed? All of that having a huge impact in terms of impact to climate and emissions. But largely scope 3 have been ignored for a long time. But now we're seeing a big shift too. We've got these science-based targets and targets that include the entire impact of the company. And again, this is a massive shift in approach. This is going to take a lot more resource to get a hold of, a lot more investment, a lot more support and data and staff. But this is the kind of level that we need if we're really going to tackle as businesses our sustainability impact. We have to look at the whole impact of the company. And we're starting to see just a rapid uptake on ambitious initiatives. So this is the RE100, the renewable energy initiative, trying to get companies to sign up to 100% renewable energy, not only in their direct operations, but pushing it through their supply chain as well. And you can see year on year increasing the number of companies doing that. And it really speaks to this tipping point for renewable energy demand, where the cost has become so competitive and the technology has become so accessible. We're just starting to see it scaled out rapidly now around the world. And some examples of these kind of next stage sustainability strategies that we're seeing are Microsoft. So Microsoft set their strategy last year around sustainability and what their new targets would be. And what they're looking at now is not just around So they're not just looking around carbon neutrality anymore. They're talking already about carbon negative by 2030. So actually taking out more emissions than the company produces in 10 years' time. A huge shift from where we've been. They're also talking about their historical emissions, their legacy emissions, because we've got a situation now where we've got a lot of companies coming to sustainability probably for the first time in a serious way, but they've been in existence for decades. So what about the responsibility they have for all those emissions that happened over the last few decades? Companies now starting to build that into their plans. So they're looking at huge afforestation programs. They're looking at investing in carbon capture storage, literally sucking emissions out of the air that they're responsible for. They're putting in huge money in terms of innovation that we're going to need to help close the gap on emissions. They're looking at their suppliers and how to invest in their suppliers and help them do the same, get on the same track. They're looking at the products that they're putting out into the marketplace, and not only looking at the design of them in terms of, making them as efficient as possible, and making them, circular in terms of their design and their packaging, but designing them so that they help the end user reduce their impact as well. So really spreading their influence through every element of their business and taking responsibility for all those impacts that the company has. And we saw a recent announcement from Google that kind of reflects the same level of ambition. So they're looking at going completely carbon-free energy by 2030. So again, for a company like Google, when you think about their data centers and you think about their kind of core business model, that's a huge shift. And again, a positive shift from where they've come from. They're looking at their carbon neutral since, and they were 2007, but now they're going back another decade to 1998. Again, thinking about their legacy emissions, not just what they do today. Putting big money into bonds and investments, looking at their supply chains and partners as well, trying to incentivize innovation in this space, supporting startups with technology that will help them get their emissions down. And again, thinking about their customer base, their huge amount of customers, billions of customers around the world, and how can they help them through their products and through their data reduce their emissions and change their behaviors, and again take responsibility for their whole impact, not just what's happening in their one building or in their data center, but in through everything that they do, their products, their supply chains, their entire scopes. And the other big shift we're seeing as well is this idea of closing the loop, so that the circular economy. So while we've got companies, really going big on sustainability in terms of their processes and their systems, we still have a case where the business model is still kind of feeding the beast in terms of, more stuff. So we've got the example here of Apple, where, a company that's quite progressive in terms of renewable energy and putting in a huge amount of efficiency measures, looking at their packaging in a big way. But the business model is still based on new models each year, more than one each year even, and driving that demand. So that next stage we need to get to now is cutting that need to have new and more stuff and linking that with growth, and finally figuring out how to close the loop. So trying to get away from this linear model, where we're taking stuff, virgin materials out of the earth, we're making stuff, we're distributing it, somebody's consuming it and disposing of it, and we don't know where it's going. We're not using the waste, even though it's valuable, it could be used again. We're not capturing it at the moment. And if you remember, we went through in the first week, is even though we know we have issues with consumption, our consumption continues to grow. Over 100 billion tons of stuff last year, and less than 8% of that recovered. So there is a huge opportunity to look at innovation in the space and close the loop and change what this model looks like, to get to this circular model where we have much less, zero reliance ideally on taking those raw materials out of the ground and just using what we have. And huge amount of innovation again in this space, where we have landfill mining, literally going through landfills trying to find those valuable materials that we've disposed of. We have space mining, there's a huge amount of space junk circulating up there, but again, valuable materials. And now the onus is on companies to design this process in, designing products that can be taken apart easily, that can be segregated, we can get back into a supply chain quicker than we have been able to in the past. And there's a huge amount of innovation in this space at the moment. So the likes of Loop, where it's have got a customer delivery service where You might buy, your shampoos or your dishwasher liquid, all of them coming in reusable containers now to your door on an electric vehicle. You use them, you send them back, Loop cleans them, they send them back refilled, and the cycle continues. So taking a huge amount of packaging, taking a huge amount of emissions out of the system, out of the process. We have IKEA, as I talked about before, moving now to a leasing model because they know there's no future in a fast furniture model. They need to change. If we're talking about science-based targets and a company figuring out how it needs to stay within the limits of what we know, fast furniture doesn't make sense anymore. So shifting, more to services, to products, looking now to be a mass provider of renewable energy to homes around the world, and looking at the whole take back infrastructure opportunity as well. So new jobs and new investments in terms of recycling and repairing of items as well. This is H&M, and we talked about these quite a bit in our sectoral challenge, but H&M effectively at the moment a fast fashion company, and while they've made good efforts in terms of sustainable sourcing and moving to more sustainable materials, still not fundamentally challenging the model of lots and lots of new clothes each day going out. So now starting to take the bigger picture approach and look at what closing the loop looks like to them. So they've started with the small stuff in terms of customers being able to bring clothes back to the stores, but there's huge issues there in terms of the recyclability of some of those items, the quality of them. So now investing much bigger in the technology, investing upstream in terms of the raw materials that they're using so that they're getting better quality items back in to recycle. And this is their store in Sweden, just trying to show the customer how this process works and incentivize them to come along with them on the journey, I suppose, and bring them back the materials that they need. And again, going back to the core business model and changing what it is that they do. And there's huge opportunities, and again, in this for alternatives, because the customer is looking for more sustainable options. So this is Depop, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, a secondhand platform for clothing. It's growing 28 to 30 times faster than your traditional high street retailer. So there's demand here. So it's not only around the sustainability and climate benefits that come with a platform like this, it's the customer is changing as well. And there's so much space for innovation with the climate challenge to help customers live their values and help them access the things that they need in a way that they want. We see Asda now rolling out bulk shelving and bulk aisles around the UK, where as a customer, you can come in with your bottle or your jar and you can fill up on what you need. You don't need any packaging. You only take what you need. And now they're branching out into vintage furniture and other reusables, because again, they've sensed the market, they're tapping into it, and they know it's going to be a big part of their future growth. And for agriculture as well, which sometimes gets left out of the circular conversation, but obviously a huge focus area in terms of emission reduction and waste. We're wasting 30% of our food every single day. So a big focus now on changing how we do agriculture and moving to this regenerative approach where we improve soil quality, where we don't waste anything, we put it back into the soil, we get those nutrients back in, we reduce our need on different nutrients and different fertilizers, and we try to get that much better balance of growing food efficiently with the planetary limits in mind and the planetary needs in mind. And this not just being an idea now for small farmers trying to showcase good behavior. This now being taken as the future approach for major food companies around the world. So General Mills have invested hugely in this because, again, they look at their supply chain, they look at the vulnerability of their supply chain to climate change. And regenerative agriculture gives them a much better chance of being able to know how yields are going to perform, how they're going to be able to withstand climate change and ideally reduce the impacts of climate change. Walmart came out with a similar plan last week as well. So a huge change from what we would have seen around industrial farming, maybe looking at, the efficiency of the lighting in sheds, to now this much more systemic change around looking at the core way things are done and rewriting them in a way that makes sense for climate and climate action. And again, lots of room for innovation in this space. So this is Toast Ale, some of you might be familiar with, where the product is made from the waste of bread from bakeries and retailers around the UK. So they've been able again to tap into a huge market of customers wanting to buy with their values, reducing waste as they do it, and tapping into that growth potential. So it's not just around closing down industries, it's about finding those new gaps, those new ways that we can, we can make new products and we can drive new innovation, but in a way that's aligned with what we need to do in terms of climate change. And transparency is another huge driver of what we're seeing, because when we think back to those few examples of scandals, there's hundreds of those examples. And as I was saying, there's less room for companies to hide in this space now, whether it's regulation, whether it's litigation, whether it's technology that's giving us access to supply chains and what's going on. Companies have really had to clean up their game around this and get themselves in a position where they're able to open up their supply chains and show what they're doing. So the reporting landscape is getting, very busy for companies. And we're seeing this real shift from very kind of light voluntary reporting, 10 years ago, let's say, to much more stringent, much more holistic, and increasingly mandatory approach to reporting, where companies now have to submit their data in terms of their impacts. Thinking back to that scope 1, 2, and 3, a big focus on that scope 3 now and what's going on, looking at everything from, yes, their emissions, but also their governance, who's in charge, who's responsible for it, looking at the social side of sustainability, and looking at their future plans. So in terms of their risks and their exposure to climate change, what is their plan to change their industry to make sure that they're going to be around in 10, 20, 30 years. And this landscape, like I say, getting very busy, and companies year on year having to disclose more and more on what they're doing. And for the customer as well, the customer wanting to know where the product comes from, what's happened in the supply chain, huge demand in that space. So we've seen the likes of Marks and Spencer's publish their interactive supplier map, where you can go on and see where your products are coming from, what the farm looks like, what their practices are. This is an example from IKEA, where they've made public where their emissions are coming from. And it's interesting here, because if you look in the middle, you see the stores, the goods transport, they're only 4% each. And traditionally that would have been where all the focus was, just making the stores efficient, getting those energy efficiency pieces in, the water efficiency, the waste down. But the real impact is happening upstream and downstream. So your raw material use, so where is the wood coming from? Where is the packaging coming from? The plastic? And then on the other side, how is the customer using the product? Are they recycling it? Are they bringing it back? Are they keeping it for a longer life? And all of that's really telling in terms of a company now needing to completely rethink sustainability and make sure that they widen their scope to take in those big areas, take responsibility for what's happening in the supply chain, support the customer in doing the right thing when the product's at an end of life, and a complete switch in terms of how sustainability used to be looked at. We're seeing technology helping this as well. So this is provenance of blockchain technology, where you can scan a code and you can get the details of the supply chain on your phone, and where things were sourced, any sustainability standards that were there, any risks, and putting all that in the customer's hand in terms of their ability to make a choice around the products that they want to buy. And similarly, we're seeing the rise again of carbon labeling. So this was trialed about 10 years ago and didn't take off. And at the time, the customer maybe wasn't ready to understand, is 260 grams of carbon good or bad? But now, a numerous amount of retailers and companies feeling that the company is ready. A bit of a race on at the moment to get labels on pack to show their carbon efficiency. But a huge amount of work has to go on in the background to get that figure on pack. Full life cycle analysis of your entire process. You have to get data throughout your supply chain and figure out what is your CO2 figure. And then obviously when you have it, there's a pressure to get that number as low as possible. So carbon labeling, welcome in that it's forcing companies to take a much deeper look at their supply chains, and getting themselves in a position that they're happy to share their impact and that it's as low as it possibly can be. So with all this happening, all these different pressures building, this real awakening from companies that, your incremental sustainability approach is not enough. We're starting to see this complete shift now in terms of what a business is, and starting to see these new models emerging, these new climate ready models. So we're seeing brands, completely change in how they show up for sustainability. So the likes of Patagonia starting to stand with customers in terms of using their brand to stand up for different issues that matter to them. So with Patagonia, yes, they've got brilliant processes in place. They're good on the circular economy, but they're going beyond that. They use their stores to bring together customers and local residents to talk about climate literacy. They march at climate action marches. The line's getting really blurred in terms of what a climate activist is. It's not just your Extinction Rebellion group, but brands now joining in as well, because they know their customers are aligning with these issues and they want to support them with it. We see companies now forming groups and trying to push governments to put regulations in place that helps to level the playing field. And so it's not just the same suspects taking action, that it's a much more wider approach from business. So we saw in the US, the Business Roundtable a few years ago, would have lobbied heavily against the introduction of a carbon tax, but now calling for a carbon tax, and quite an ambitious carbon tax, because again, they see what's coming in terms of climate risk, and they want more companies to move with them. So being quite proactive in urging US leaders to take action on it. And we see that across the world, and more, especially with the COVID responses now and the EU Green Deal, business starting to stand up and advocate for wider change beyond what they can do as one company. And excuse the language in this slide, but seeing industries now, challenging what it is that they do and acknowledging maybe the complete shift needed in terms of their purpose. So advertising and marketing, having played a big role in terms of driving our need for consumption and driving our level of consumption, and now shifting to trying to be, a supporter of climate friendly lives. So initiatives like the Great Reset, and we'll hear from Laura in a few weeks as part of this initiative, but using the skills that we've honed in advertising and marketing and pivoting them towards encouraging more climate friendly consumer lifestyles, and again completely shifting what the purpose of that industry is. And we've got whole new business models starting to emerge. So the rise of B Corps is coming quite thick and fast now, and I know you cover B Corps a little bit in one of your modules, but really changing what it is to be a business and how a business is defined. What a B Corp asks a company to do is to legally consider the environment and the wider stakeholders in its purpose, way beyond just profit and your typical shareholders. And it looks for the detail of how sustainability is embedded throughout the company. So looking at the governance, looking at workers' rights, community, environment, and customers, with the thinking that once it's embedded to that level, it doesn't matter who's leading the company. It doesn't matter if a new team comes in. That is what the company is there to exist to do, to serve the environment, to serve social needs, as well as, serve, whether it's the product or service that they're creating. And it's a complete rethink. And, it's quite a difficult standard to achieve, but it's about getting it into the DNA of the company and not a side-on strategy, but this is the core of what the business does. And we've seen B Corps just grow rapidly over the last particular months and last year, where there's over 3,500 around the world. And in the early days, it was very much, your smaller companies and your startup companies, where arguably it might have been a little bit easier to build B Corp criteria in. But now we're seeing this shift to the bigger players, so Danone being the most obvious, where a company the size of Danone now going back and getting support from their shareholders to do so, and legally put into their aims and their purpose that they will serve the environment and everything that they do, and the climate and everything that they do. And it's a huge, huge shift from where they originally came from. And more companies now joining this force and this change of approach. And it's really, I suppose, paying off, because B Corps are becoming, that alternative that customers are looking for. So we're seeing the likes of this, which is Waitrose, where you can search online, you can search by B Corp, so people wanting to shop with their values, wanting to know that the companies that they're buying from are doing the right things, and now being able to easily find them and validate them with the B Corp certification. And we're seeing business, continue to rise up. So where, in some ways, governments have taken too long in terms of their approach to climate, we're seeing business not waiting anymore. So at a time where we're seeing net zero targets by 2050 by most states, including Ireland, this was at COP25 last year, where we had over 500 companies sign up to net zero by 2030. So, pretty much twice the impact in half the time. And that number has now nearly got up to 1,000 companies. So they're not waiting. They see what's coming. They know they need to change to continue to exist, and they're getting to work on it, and they're growing in number in terms of the amount of companies driving this change. We're seeing more co-op based and community based companies as well. So this is Community Power in Tipperary, an Irish co-op coming together to source local renewable energy to power the grid here in Ireland, to provide local jobs. And again, shifting what it is to be a company and the purpose of a company, and how that company is going to serve not only its own needs, but also climate needs and social needs and environmental needs as well. And a real shift in terms of how we think about growth. And this is the stage that we're getting to. We've used GDP for a long time in terms of defining our success. But we know now that it hides a lot of inequalities. It doesn't show us the full picture. In the case of the States, where, we've quite a high GDP, but a huge amount of social issues, a huge amount of inequality. It's not giving us enough look of how different states or how countries are performing. So now this real awakening that we need to change. We're changing the business model, we're changing the infrastructure. Now we need to change how we move forward in terms of how we manage growth. So this idea now of donut economics, which you might have heard about, founded by Kate Raworth a few years ago, where it's this sweet spot again, this green spot in the middle, this donut, where we need to figure out how we meet the needs of social foundation, where we close the gap on inequality, where people have equal access to the necessities in life, the food, the water, the energy, and that we stay within that ecological ceiling. We're running out of planet, we're running out of space to grow on, we're running out of water to withdraw. Climate change is running away with us. We need to, rein that in, and we need to design now with these two limits in mind. And like I say, find that spot in the middle and letting that define how we grow forward and how we develop our business models going forward. So we're in this massive time of shifting now with business sustainability. So, as I was talking about at the beginning, moving away from that whole, environmentally sustainability, low-hanging fruit, resource efficiency, even CSR not being enough. That's your kind of business as usual approach. We're very much in this disruptive innovation stage where we're starting to see that reaction to new ways of doing things, new opportunities in terms of what customers want, challenging business models, and just about starting to see the beginning of this transformative innovation where we're getting to that donut economic stage. We're getting to that completely redesigning a business, and the beginnings of that we're seeing, with the likes of B Corp, but much more societal change happening there as well. But we're just about getting to the start of it. And for sustainability as a function, and I suppose for you guys in your future, what's really interesting to see is this whole integration of sustainability within companies. So very much that first image there on the top left was the traditional approach to sustainability, where it very much sat on the outside. Either it was its own function within the company, siloed away, or it was external consultants brought in, but not fully integrated into the thinking of how the business did things. Then we moved on to a little bit more integration, a bit more in-house support. Now a lot of companies are still at this stage, at stage 3, where it's much better being integrated across key functions, but needing to get to stage 4 now, where essentially, sustainability doesn't need to exist as a silo function. It's everyone's job, and everyone has this new mindset and this new lens, where you won't have a business plan anymore and a sustainability plan. There'll be the one plan, because that is the only way the company and the industry will move forward. And the pace is really picking up on this. So as I was saying, we've never seen the level of response that we've seen from business and industry before, as we have of the last 18 to 24 months. And we're seeing that playing out across different industries. So here in Ireland, we're seeing Bord na Móna, cutting peat extraction much earlier than we thought, moving quickly into nature-based services now and redesigning their whole business and what it is they do. We've seen the electric car industry pick up pace more than anyone would have expected over the last few years. If you take the example of Honda, made the commitment in 2015 that 2/3 of their cars would be electric by 2030, then talked about stopping diesel production in 2025. And as of today, they stopped diesel production last week, and they'll be stopping pure petrol production by next year. So getting quicker and quicker as the demand, as the need, as the understanding, as the market improves for all this. We see this well around renewable energy. We see that amazing drop in price in terms of solar in particular, and now how commercially viable it is and how scalable it is. We see the likes of these new turbines going in off the coast of the UK, huge turbines, where one turbine can power 16,000 European homes. So a huge jump in the technology that's available. And again, the accessibility and the scalability of these new infrastructures. And it pays off. So I suppose we're still at the time where we need to figure out the economics of business and staying in business. And what we know now is those businesses that start to shift, those businesses that really start to integrate sustainability, do much better. So this is Unilever, and Unilever have a huge portfolio of products, under their banner. And one by one, they've been taking them and applying sustainability principles to them, how they're sourced, how they're manufactured, what it is that they do for the customer. And those brands that they call their sustainable living brands, those that they've embedded sustainability into, perform hugely better than their traditional. And they're actually delivering 75% of the company's growth. So all the growth is coming from these sustainable living brands. We know that B Corps are growing 28 times faster than a traditional company. And it's easy to see why. When you think about, they're thinking about the climate risk, they're thinking about future-proofing the company, they're appealing to that new customer and those new markets. So it's doing the right thing by the climate, but it's also tapping into that huge opportunity. And for companies now, there's three main focuses going forward, and we'll pick up on this when we get to our strategy session. But it's around accountability, so setting those science-based targets, looking at the full scope, the scope 1, 2, and 3 of the company's impacts. It's about ambition, so looking at that 1.5, 2 degree world. What does that look like for your company? How do you fit in to that world? And going way beyond those incremental energy efficiency targets. And it's about advocacy, increasingly understanding that no one company can take enough action on this. As industries, we need to work together if we're really going to see that systemic change. So it's like the US Business Roundtable calling for carbon taxes. It's like businesses in the UK and calling for a Build Back Better kind of Green Deal approach response to COVID, just to make sure that it's a level playing field and to make sure that there's a collective response and it's not just the usual suspects that we see. And at the end of the day, a sustainable business is one that respects those limits that we now know, that manages its risk in terms of encroaching climate change and encroaching climate issues, that innovates, finds a new way to exist, a new market to tap into, meets those growing customer needs, those growing customers with values that they want to shop with and want to align with. And from an employee sense, attracts and retains talent, people that want to work for companies that are doing the right thing. At the end of the day, continues to exist. Because the companies take the risk, they don't innovate, they don't change tact, they're already getting left behind, and it's going to be very, very difficult for them to continue to exist in our world going forward. So that's the end of today's lecture. Like I say, I'll be back next week. So if anyone has any questions on any of the material that we've covered, take a note of it and we'll pick up on them when I'm back. And these slides will pop up as well on the site on UCD, so you'll be able to access them. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.